Parents, the following program is intended for people over the age of 13. If your kids are younger than that, please use the YouTube Kids app. Peter Bernard's Scary Stories for Adults.
These next two stories we've got for you both take place in Pennsylvania, which seems to be one of the strangest places in the world. We get the weirdest stories sent to us from PA, and these two are no exception. Both involve the Dogman, or werewolves, or whatever these dog-headed furry things actually are that people claim to see. Both stories are alleged by their authors to be true, but I wasn't there, so I don't know personally. All I do know is that both of these creeped me out when I read them, and I hope they have a similar effect on you. So dim the light, pull your covers up, or get your popcorn ready, because we're about to dive headlong into two Pennsylvania Dogman stories. The Devil's Road Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I've got a story for you that incorporates two of the most famous scary myths of Pennsylvania. Two for the price of one. Not only did we visit haunted Devil's Road, but we saw the Pennsylvania Dogman too. This all happened back in the year 2000, when my wife and I were deciding to celebrate our first wedding anniversary by driving around legend tripping for a couple weeks in the northeastern United States. We drove down different allegedly haunted roads and did whatever we were supposed to do in order to make the scary hauntings happen, but we had no luck attracting the spookiness to us. Maybe we were still too happy back then for anything scary to really get a foothold. That all changed one night when we decided to drive down the famous Devil's Road in Chaddsford, Pennsylvania. According to legend, the road has trees growing away from it as though they were recoiling in horror from the evil road itself. When we actually got there, we could see that all the trees on both sides of the road were bent in the same direction, the direction from which they could receive the most sun during the day. Still, it did look kinda spooky at night, and that's what we were there for, to get to experience something spooky. We were about to get more than we had bargained for. The Devil's Road is really called Cossert Road. It's very narrow and long and windy, so I can understand people wanting to believe it's haunted in some way. There are old stories going back generations that a mansion hidden up in the hills off the road used to be the site of strange, inbred, mega-rich elites holding horrifying rituals. All sorts of evil things were alleged to have taken place there, but it would be quite dangerous and quite illegal to try to break into the grounds and see for yourself. We were strictly on a legal legend-tripping vacation. No breaking and entering charges for us, thank you. But it didn't matter on that particular evening, as the scariness was about to break out of its hiding spot and come looking for us. As we drove along the road, I found a nice secluded spot where I could pull off to the right and park. As I did so, I claimed to my wife that we had run out of gas. When she checked the dashboard, I put my hand in her face to block her gaze. She started laughing, understanding that we had plenty of gas, but I just wanted some alone time with her in this spooky location. I turned the engine off, and the two of us cuddled and enjoyed each other's company for a while. We were young. That was our job at the time. The first thing I noticed wrong was when the car seemed to be moving up and down. No, get your mind out of the gutter. I mean something besides us was making the car seem to move up and down. I got frightened that we were rolling down a hill or something, but when I looked outside, I saw that we were still in the same place as before. I turned around to look 360 degrees, and I saw that a very large, hairy man was standing outside, pushing down on our trunk. He'd push down, let go, push down again, rhythmically. The figure was so large that I could not see its face from my point of view. In a few seconds, I went from thinking that someone in a fur coat was messing with us to thinking it was too large to be a man, so it must be a Bigfoot. Bigfoot, I said to my wife, and she started looking in the rearview mirror at it and screaming like a girl in a horror movie. It's funny. This was exactly what we had been hoping for, wishing for, searching for. We had wanted to have a real-life moment like one that would happen in a horror movie. We got exactly what we had been asking for, and yet, when the moment arrived, it wasn't fun in the slightest. It was terrifying. We genuinely thought we were going back to our maker that night, both of us. It was an adrenaline rush, all right, but not like bungee jumping. My wife was screaming at me to start the ignition and to get out of there. She was extremely hurtful and unpleasant in her requests, and we found ourselves bickering as I tried to turn the key unsuccessfully. The car, bouncing up and down, was hard to cope with. I started feeling ill, and my wife screeched that I was going to flood the engine. She tried to reach over and turn the key, and we were battling over that when I saw something large and furry approaching the driver's seat window to my left. I turned and looked in silent shock and horror, while my wife kept arguing with someone behind me. I shrunk down in my seat and looked up, trying to see the face of the thing. It was still too high for me to see from my vantage point, but I was certain it had to be Bigfoot. Then, something happened that not only explained the identity of this creature, but managed to quiet my wife for a minute as well. The thing bent down suddenly and looked into the window. Its face was maybe an inch or two from my face. Its fangs just on the other side of the glass from my eyeballs, which were now shedding tears that ran down my cheeks. That was the ugliest looking face I had ever seen, but it was not an ape-like face as I had expected to see. It could not have been human or Bigfoot, as the thing had ears on top of its head instead of on either side. It had a long snout ending in a dark leathery nose. While it displayed its immense fangs, it panted and drooled. The eyes were hidden behind the most intense eye-shine glow I have ever experienced with any animal. When the thing made a loud barking type of roar, the window between us vibrated and my ears were deafened for a second. The deafness was immediately replaced with a loud ringing that still sometimes comes back to me even to this day. It sure quieted my wife down, I'll say that much. So we were not having a meeting with Bigfoot at all. We were having a meeting with a werewolf, or skinwalker, or maybe the Pennsylvania Dogman. I don't remember the car starting, but I remember noting that it was running. I remember slowly driving away, and the Dogman trotting along to my left as though he were our pet dog, running after us as we drove off to work in the morning. As we sped up, and the creature realized we were actually intent on leaving, it started growling and expressing unhappiness with us. Once we had all four wheels back on the blacktop, I floored it and tried to accelerate to the best of our old Honda's ability. It was a dependable car, but not one that was built for racing, so that Dogman was able to speed up right along with us. As I got us up over 30 and heading toward 40 miles an hour, the beast fell behind, but it just kept running after us. It ran on two legs like an Olympian sprinter, but it seemed capable of much greater endurance than a human runner. We got to 50 miles an hour and kept climbing, and I felt certain the creature was falling back now. We both breathed a sigh of relief, and I asked my wife if she could try to get a photo of the thing as we drove away. That's when something happened that I never would have predicted. The thing fell to all fours, and it actually sped up. I could see it gaining on us, and then it was out of my field of vision. The next thing that happened wasn't something I could see, but it was certainly something I could feel. The creature grabbed onto our tail end. I don't know where or how it had a hold of us because I couldn't see, but somehow the creature was holding onto the car and pulling us down back there. I admit I panicked and I swerved left and right and left, and the car bounced and jumped all over that narrow road. The beast made horrible sounds from back there, and I count myself lucky that I couldn't see what was happening. My wife was screaming incoherently, and the entire scene was utter chaos. By this point, we started heading out of the forested part of the road toward the end, where there's a farm and some houses. It's more open over there, and the creature didn't seem to want to hang with us anymore. I could feel the weight released off our tail end, and the beast seemed to melt back into the woods out of sight and out of mind. We were both utterly freaked out, and I remember getting on some highway, but I don't remember which. I just wanted to get on a big highway so I would stop feeling like a Dogman was going to jump out at me. I didn't want to see any trees for a while. We found a hotel or a motel, and we got some food and some sleep. The next morning, we asked around and found a local internet cafe. Remember those? We were able to get on a computer and look up some of the stuff that had happened to us the night before. We couldn't find any stories online about Dogman sightings on that road, but we did find stories alleging that demonic or satanic rituals had taken place in that area. All of a sudden, the fun had gone out of legend tripping for us. It just seemed like something too serious to play around with, so we shifted our focus and spent the rest of our vacation checking out roadside attractions and less scary local legends. I could be completely wrong, but to me, that Dogman sighting somehow seems to have something to do with people performing dark rituals. I don't think that was just an animal. It behaved so oddly. It seemed too intelligent, and yet it was so hostile. It just seemed evil to me. Of all the places my wife and I have ever been in our lives, the one place we both agree we would never ever want to return to is the Devil's Road in Pennsylvania, where we saw the Devil's Road Dogman.
Peter Bernard's Scary Stories for Adults will return right after this. I'll be coming home for Christmas, if only in your nightmares. It's me, Dr. Death, and I'll be coming home here to Scary Stories NYC to tell you the scariest Dogman Christmas story I've ever heard. Yes, it will be hosted by me, then read from beginning to end by none other than the prodigal dad himself, PQ Ribber. We will release it 2 days before Christmas on Monday, December 23rd, 2019, a date that will live in infamy, I assure you. With the changes coming to YouTube in January, this might be your last chance ever to hear an all-new story hosted by me and read by PQ Ribber. Mark the date down. I'll expect to see you there. This episode is sponsored by the Scary Stories Paid Subscribers Club. Become a paid subscriber at peterbernard.com.
The Concrete City Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, about 3 hours drive west of New York City and about as long a drive north from Philadelphia, there exists a ghost town known as Concrete City. It's located in the suburbs of a place called Nanticoke that I found myself living in for a few months back in the mid-1990s. I was in my early 20s and still hanging with my buddies that I had known since high school. We were probably already too old to be acting the way we did, but we liked doing things to dare each other, and we liked doing things to scare each other. The night we dared each other to spend the night in Concrete City, we did both. The history of the place is that it was built in 1911 to house workers for a railroad company. The buildings were made in what is called the International style, which meant big, blocky concrete buildings. They'd never burned down, although they seemed somewhat cold both inside and out. The railroad didn't need the buildings very long, and they were eventually sold to a mine owner to house his workers. By that point, repairs were needed that the new owner couldn't afford. He tried to tear the buildings down and erect new ones, but he found that their concrete construction was nearly indestructible, so he completely abandoned the town in 1924. It was only inhabited for 13 unlucky years, and since that time, it's been left to rot and crumble. The military and police use it for practice maneuvers, and urban explorers illegally invade the place fairly regularly. According to the internet, paintball players have games there, but the only paint I remember seeing in those days was the graffiti, which was everywhere. Two of my buddies kept bragging that they had been to the place plenty of times, so we let them lead the way as we drove there that night. They got us lost, and we eventually had to get directions from a gas station attendant. He advised us not to go there at night. It was dangerous enough during the day, he said, with walls crumbling everywhere. At night, you could trip over something or lose your footing. It just wasn't worth it to make the trip, in his opinion. Of course, that only made us want to go even more. When we arrived at the place, at first it was a bit underwhelming. There were concrete buildings built around 3 out of 4 edges of a big square space, and in the center was a big field of grass. Apparently that was where there used to be a central pool or a fountain or something. We got out of the car and walked toward the building that was least covered in trees. Walking inside, you could see how filthy everything was, and I asked for the first time what the actual definition was of us staying there for the night. I said if we had to sleep there, I called dibs on the back seat of the car. We hadn't brought camping equipment, and it was too nasty inside that building for me to consider staying there. An argument ensued where we all debated what the rules of the game actually were. Someone said sleeping in the car would be cheating. Someone else called dibs on the front seat. and on like that. We left that first building and started wandering across the big lawn in between the old husks of buildings on the outer edges. The argument was still in full bloom as to what we were actually there to do, and one person was by that point complaining that this was all boring. Not enough action, just a bunch of old buildings falling down, who cares? Right at that moment, immediately after he said that, we saw what looked like a guy with no clothes running out of a building toward us, and we all screamed. It went from not interesting to a little bit too interesting in 1 second. I shone my flashlight on the guy, and I could see this was not a regular guy wearing nothing. It was a big hairy dog running on its hind legs as though it were a guy. Or else it was an incredibly hairy guy wearing a dog head mask, maybe. The hair was so thick, it was just like dog fur, but it was too skin tight in its appearance to be a monkey suit. What I mean to say is, it wasn't baggy and it didn't fold as it ran. It looked like hair was really growing out of his skin, or else that it was glued onto his skin. Either way, it didn't seem as though it could possibly be a suit of any kind. It had to be what it looked like, a big, muscular man with a pituitary problem and a dog-shaped head? Or a very muscular dog. Analysis over. It dawned on me that this might be a bad thing to have to deal with face to face. I turned and ran. I was no longer part of a group of people. I was a single individual, intent on my own survival. After I started running, the rest joined me, but I was the first to get back to the car. And of course, when I did, I found it locked. We all had to wait for the slowest of us to get there because he had the car keys. We got in and locked our doors as that Dogman was catching up to us. It leaped on the roof and ran back and forth onto the hood, the roof, the trunk, and over again, barking savagely, growling, and snapping at the front and rear windshields menacingly. We screamed at our stupid, slow friend to start the car, but he was crying and weeping for his mommy. He wasn't able to see well enough to put the key in. Whoever was in the passenger seat at the time did the honors, and we soon found ourselves rolling out of there with a Dogman on our roof and our driver crying like a baby. We rolled through some woods and the Dogman was going crazy trying to tear our roof off and get in at us. We were all shouting at our driver to go faster, but he was in some kind of a state of shock and he just cried and drove us forward robotically. We passed through woods which seemed to last eternally. And then we came out of them by the old mental home over there. I swear, the Dogman stopped what it was doing and jumped off the car roof when we passed the mental institution. He ran toward it, and we couldn't see him any longer. My crying friend just kept driving us robotically until we reached the intersection at SB Street, and someone switched places with him. I remember him getting in the back seat, leaning his head on my shoulder, and sobbing uncontrollably the rest of the way back to our town. He was pathetic, but I didn't really blame him. My heart was still going 1,000,000 miles an hour, and I was paranoid, looking over my shoulder for monsters most of the next month. People ask me what the thing looked like exactly, and I have to say, I really didn't have time to study him. I know I perceived it as a dog, but it ran like a man. I don't have a specific mental memory of its paws or hands, but I remember it acting like a man. The head was like a German shepherd, but all black, with glowing eyes and much larger teeth than any domesticated dog would ever have. It was savage, and it was fast. It wanted to rip us out of the sardine can we were in, but something at the mental hospital was more attractive to it. Maybe it sensed easier game. Maybe, on the other hand, we had given it a lift home? I suppose I'll never know what really happened the night we encountered the concrete city. Dogman. This next scary Dogman story comes to us from a viewer who claims it was told to them by their late grandmother. I have no idea if the stories are true or if his grandmother really told them to him, but I'm not gonna call the guy a liar. After all, he's given us this really creepy collection of Dogman encounters, which we are calling the Deathbed Confession Dogman Stories. Dear Scary Stories NYC, my grandmother was confined to a bed in our house for most of the last 3 months of her life, way back in the late 1990s. While there, she told me lots of stories about the past, including a few particularly scary Dogman encounters. My mother forbade me from repeating them, and I didn't for years. Since Mom passed about half a year ago, the stories have been coming back to my mind, and I've decided to write them down for you in an anonymous format. This way, I'm sort of honoring my mother's request never to tell the family's secret, while also relieving my own internal emotional pressure. I've been dying for years to tell these stories to someone. My mother would get very emotionally upset when telling me not to repeat this stuff. She said Grandma wasn't always herself toward the end, and that is true. But she mainly had trouble remembering more recent things. Her stories about the old days were always accurate and interesting. In fact, Mom used to say it was good for Grandma to talk about the old days when she was talking about Grandpa or remembering Mom's own childhood. It was only when she spoke about Dogman that Mom became nervous and claimed it was the illness speaking. So, I'll tell you the stories as I remember them, and you can decide. Were these the rantings of an ill mind, as my mother suggested, or are they true memories, as my grandmother insisted? When Grandma and Grandpa got married, it was actually arranged back in the old country. Grandpa was already here, and Grandma was sent to the U.S. to marry him. This was after the Second World War, in the early 1950s. They were a lucky young couple in that they fell in love. Grandma always used to say that she was fated to marry Grandpa. It may have been a marriage arranged to align two families, but to Grandma, it was love at first sight. They spent a week together in separate rooms at a hotel in New York City, getting acquainted, then got married downtown by some city official or other, and moved up to the Bronx, to the house that Grandpa's family had built for them. I never saw this house myself, as they moved away from there soon after my mother was born, but the way Grandma described it, the place was located on a dirt road and nestled in a forest. There were no neighbors or other houses on the block, and a stream ran through the backyard just inside the forest back there. I would question her if this was the Bronx, as in the Bronx, like the borough north of Manhattan in New York City. That Bronx is known as an urban area, not a forested one. Could it still have been like that in the earlier mid-1950s? Grandma said yes, so we'll say this took place in the Bronx, New York. Maybe she meant Yonkers or New Rochelle or something, I don't know. So, in this allegedly forested part of the Bronx of the 1950s, Grandma and Grandpa moved in and celebrated their honeymoon, learning about their new home in the process. Grandpa had to go away on family business soon after, leaving Grandma with his brother to help her get the house set up properly to live in. The very first night Grandpa was away, trouble reared its dog-like head. According to Grandma, she was awakened from her sleep by the idea that something had just bumped into the house. She lay there awake for some time, wondering if it had really happened or if she had dreamed it. She was just dozing off when it happened again, and she didn't just hear it this time, she could feel it as well. Getting out of bed and going to the central part of the house, Grandma found her brother-in-law there, looking around through the windows. He had been awakened as well, and he was just as curious as she was. They each peeked out through different windows, and Grandma told me she really wasn't sure what she was looking for. She hoped it would be some animal and not a gang of bad guys or criminals. Sometimes you should be careful what you wish for. She peered out through a window onto the lawn outside, and what she described as the head of one of Satan's personal pet hounds reared its face up from under that window, just as though it had been waiting there to scare the daylights out of her. Seeing how frightened she was, the dog barked ferociously and sidestepped backward away from the window. Both Grandma and her brother-in-law could see most of the creature's body at that point, and they could see that it was standing up like a man would. Grandma screamed in horror. It was too much for her to understand. Her husband's brother ran outside to scare the thing off, and it ran before he could get near to it. The thing moved swiftly, with grace and agility, but remained on its hind legs the entire time. I asked Grandma to explain what its face looked like, since she is one of the few people to ever get a close-up look at a dogman or werewolf or whatever that was. She told me that it just looked like a wild dog, a very feral, nasty-looking dog that had lived its life going from one violent disruption to another. It looked like it had a fight every single day of its life, that's what she told me. It was angry when she saw it, and she had a feeling it was angry most of the rest of the time as well. Both of them were unable to get back to sleep, so Grandma said she made coffee and they started their day early. Paranoia about the dog-headed beast man led Grandma and her brother-in-law to be on a nocturnal schedule, sleeping during the day, long before Grandpa returned from this family business trip. When he did return, he dismissed the stories of dog-headed werewolves and insisted Grandma return to a normal diurnal schedule, or else use her discretionary funds to hire him a maid and a cook. Back then, the deal was that Grandpa brought in the money while Grandma made him breakfast and dinner, so it wasn't considered out of line for him to be demanding about his morning coffee. As it turned out, the dogman didn't come around when Grandpa was home. He seemed to respect my family's patriarch as the master of the land. Whenever Grandpa went away on business, however, and this would happen roughly every other month, the dogman would return to bother Grandma and whomever she could convince to come stay with her there at the house. These were stories that I really found frightening, as she was expecting my mother when these happened. Grandma was about 3 or 4 months into the pregnancy and taking a leisurely stroll around the grounds before dinner. It was evening, but not night, and there was a beautiful sunset which she was enjoying. From inside the forest, she heard something stirring around. Curious what creatures lived in the area and not yet sensing any danger, Grandma told me she leaned in between some trees and squinted into the darkness. She didn't see anything but trees at first and was about to withdraw her head when something caught her attention out of the corner of her eye. Looking directly at it, she saw that it was eyeshine. Grandma said she had never seen eyeshine before, or at least she had never taken conscious notice of it, so it frightened her, and she stepped back from those woods. The eyes did not seem human, but they were well up over the ground. Most likely whatever that was had to be over 6 feet tall. According to Grandma, she was still slowly backing away from the trees, and she was quite stunned by what she had seen. But her brain was still making calculations, and she hadn't finished her mathematics yet. It reached the point where she asked herself, "What did I just see?" There was a longing to go back into the woods and have a second look, but there was just as strong an urge to turn and run for home. A sound of leaves being moved roughly shocked her out of her complacency, and Grandma turned to walk briskly toward the house. She felt silly, as she was probably running away from an owl or something else harmless like that. She kept turning and looking over her shoulder, hoping each time that she would see something like a deer emerging from the woods behind her. It was when she was about 20 feet away from the back door to the house when she heard something walking out of those woods. This time when she turned, she got a full view of what it was, and nearly all her questions were instantly answered. Except she had no idea what those answers meant. Behind Grandma was what she described as a man-shaped dog. It was a thick-legged dog that stood like a man. Its front paws appeared more like hands, with dagger-like claws coming out of the end of each finger. This was not the same as the thing which had looked into the window at her and her brother-in-law, but it appeared to be of the same species. This was the single most terrifying thing she'd ever seen, and now she did run. Once the back door was open and Grandma was about to go inside, she saw that the thing was now about halfway into her yard, giving her a curious look. It was not running after her, but it was instead walking bipedally, trying to get a better look at her. Grandpa returned home earlier than planned, and there was a bit of a hubbub about the incident. Local men gathered to search the woods for the monster with the dog's head and the shining eyes. They didn't find anything, and within a week, everything had returned to normal. Everyone went back to their regular roles and chores. As frightening as it had been, the incident was viewed as a one-off oddity or fluke. Whatever that monster was, it didn't belong among humans, and no doubt had gone back to wherever it came from. Now, Grandma didn't agree with any of that. She didn't think it went away. She felt it lived nearby and always would. I never asked her why she felt that way, but she would get emotional about it, so I knew she felt strongly. The next time Grandpa went away, he left 3 of his friends, all strong men, to stay with Grandma and protect her. Nothing happened. The following month, when he needed to take a 3-day trip for some reason, he and everyone else felt that Grandma would be safe on her own. At 5 or 6 months into her pregnancy, however, Grandpa hired a nurse to stay in the house until his return. On the second night of his absence from the home, Grandma wished he had left her some security to go with the health care. In the middle of the night, recalling the first incident with the Dogman looking into the window, Grandma was awakened from her sleep by something ramming into the exterior of the house. It was as though a football player were attempting to tackle her home. She knew what it likely meant, but hoped there might be a less terrible meaning. Getting out of bed and walking to the nurse's room next door, she found the lady sitting up in her bed with a horrified expression on her face. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Grandma said to the nurse. "No," answered the nurse. "I've seen a werewolf." Grandma hadn't really thought of the dog-headed beasts on the land as werewolves before. She had seen them as animals, and in fact, she told me that the nurse was wrong, and that these were some kind of bear-like dog species. The nurse felt they were supernatural and demonic or hellish entities put on Earth to perform evil acts. This lady was a trained nurse, but she was also a Protestant and convinced by her faith that something paranormal was happening. As she explained what she thought was going on to Grandma, both of them saw the beast lumber by outside the window, back 3/4 toward them. Grandma didn't think it saw them, but they saw its back, muscular to a ridiculous degree. It could have been covered in twice as much hair and still not hidden that musculature. Grandma said, never had a dog or a man been built the way this thing was. It had to be the most athletic-looking species she had ever witnessed with her own eyes. According to the way she told the story, the two women watched as the broad-shouldered beast walked into the forest and disappeared. Then, the nurse attempted to rise out of the bed, only to find her knees buckling underneath her from fright. That nurse left before sundown the next day, too scared to stay on the property any longer. When Grandpa got home from his trip, Grandma sat him down and explained the seriousness of the situation to him. It had become an unsafe place for her to spend the rest of her time expecting, and it was not a safe place to raise their child either. Grandpa didn't want to hear any of this. He found it extremely inconvenient. Grandma said he didn't want to believe anything she told him, but he had to, because his own brother had seen the beast as well that first time. Grandpa promised he would start to look for a new home to move them to, but he was quite resentful since the house had been given them by his own family. And so then my mother was born at that house one night. Everything went well that evening, and both the mother and the baby were healthy and happy. A brief period of bliss descended over the new family unit, and Grandma was able to recuperate over the next 2 months or 10 weeks before the next traumatic event took place, the one that would change everything. Grandpa was driving home from his latest business trip, and he had to stop for gas a couple of towns over. Taking the opportunity to call Grandma from a payphone, he gave her as close an estimate as he could to when he would be home later that day. Once the time came, Grandma took my mom with her, and they waited on the porch in front of the home for Grandpa to get back. Grandma said she could see a car approaching from the distance, but wasn't sure if it was her husband's car or not. She assumed it was because where they lived, there was little reason for a car to be there unless it was coming to her home. Holding the baby in her arm, Grandma walked down to street level and started wandering down the road toward where the car was coming. Soon, it was close enough to be certain that her husband was indeed arriving home. At that moment, with no advance warning whatsoever, a crashing sound erupted from the trees across the street to her right, and out onto the road spilled yet another one of those horrible, dog-headed werewolf creatures. This one, she told me, was orange, or brown with orange tips on the ends of its fur. She told me it might have been more lightly colored than the other ones. Or else maybe it was just that this was the first time she was witnessing one in broad daylight. Both the baby and her mother screamed in horror, and Grandma ran back toward the house with the Dogman in close pursuit. Soon, even louder than their screaming, was the beeping coming from Grandpa's car as he sped directly toward the Dogman and chased him back in the woods. According to Grandma, Grandpa was so stunned and surprised by the monster, he demanded Grandma get in the car, and he drove her and the baby to a hotel the next town over. She laughed when she described the terrified look on Grandpa's face and how seriously he took the situation once he had seen one of the Dogmen with his own eyes. Grandma told me that the moral of the story is that it's easy to laugh at other people when they tell you that they've seen a monster, but it's not so funny any longer when it happens to you. So my mother, even though she is a character in this story, refused to believe any of it. She said it was the result of Grandma's brain going in her final days, but I ask you, dear viewer, how many stories born of mental illness have a moral at the end? You can think what you want, but I personally lean toward accepting what Grandma told me as being accurate and coming from her genuine memories. So I tend to believe the Deathbed Confession. Dogman Stories. It's me, Henry Lee Dogman, back lurking somewhere near human turf again. I can't stick around long or the Dogman hunters will catch my scent, but I just wanted to drop off these two all-new stories about my people. One is a story sent in by a hunter who claims he saw a Dogman with two large black cats the size of panthers. That comes later. But first, here's a new allegedly true story sent in by a businessman who says this really happened to him back when he was first starting out in the world as a young man. And that story is called The Camouflaged Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I once had an encounter with Dogman on an autumn evening in Michigan. It came at the most unexpected moment when I was having fun and relaxing with my first serious girlfriend. Obviously, we got away and neither of us was hurt, but it almost turned out in very much the opposite way when we discovered by accident that in autumn, Dogman is quite well camouflaged. I've seen the videos you've run by that woman who shows her photographs of trees that she thinks Dogman is hiding in. Although I personally have not been able to see what she's describing, I know from personal experience that animals can and do hide themselves sometimes in plain sight. And yes, my Dogman encounter was an example of just exactly that. So I do understand where that lady is coming from. Where I am coming from is a place outside of Grand Rapids, Michigan. I don't want to get more specific than that because we both have family still there, and we haven't moved far from there ourselves in the time since this all happened. Grand Rapids is a city, but out by where we lived, it was a mix of suburbs and the country, depending on what part of town you were in. We had houses with big backyards, lots of snow to shovel or plow in the winter, and lots of leaves to rake in the autumn. I was in my early 20s, and although I had 7 or 8 relationships that I guess could be called boyfriend-girlfriend type things, the first person I really fell in love with head over heels was this young woman we can call Diana, because she is a Wonder Woman. You'll have to forgive me as we are married now, and she will be reading this before I send it in. She's my super friend and my super editor. I met Diana when my mother forced me to go to church one Easter against my will. I think we were both 18-ish back then. She was really stunning, and she was the only girl that I ever stuttered when I talked to. She seemed like a character out of an old movie. She spoke with less of a local accent than the other people I knew, and I instantly liked her. I was too shy to get her contact information or even her name on that Sunday, but fate was already working on giving me a second chance. My uncle got me a job in his company that I started 3 days after I finished undergraduate classes in college. I worked in the mailroom, but since I was in the family, they hoped I would prove competent enough for them to promote me quickly. When I finally earned my first promotion, my replacement was literally that girl I had met on Easter Sunday a few years earlier, Diana. So we became friendly at work, but she and I had never been in a situation with each other that wasn't formal. The office was old school, and so was our church. We'd only ever been dressed, presentably, and there with other people present. I really wanted to ask her out, but I knew we'd need to keep it on the down low around the office. Soon, we were having an affair that involved us leaving work separately, taking different means of transportation to meet at a spot we didn't think any of our coworkers would frequent, and having dinner together or catching shows. It was still all very formal, and even after we'd been dating almost a year, we'd really never let down our guard with each other. We'd never even seen each other dressed casually, and I began to wonder if we really knew each other well enough to be in love. It was practically an internet romance in that sense. I went to visit my uncle with my parents one weekend just randomly, and when he seemed in a good mood, I took him aside and risked telling him a version of what had been going on with me and Diana. I knew he might have helpful ideas for me, or that he might fire me on the spot for dating a subordinate, but I felt something needed to change, and I almost didn't care what. I wanted to marry Diana, and I needed to be able to be public about seeing her before that could even be considered. It turned out my uncle loved that I included him in my sordid life details, and he told me he'd take care of it. When I showed up to work the next day, I was greeted by the sight of people from the mailroom emptying out my desk into boxes and moving them. I almost died right on the spot. I thought I was fired. It turned out my uncle had given me my own office and had promoted Diana to working as my assistant. Rather than pleasing us, this sort of embarrassed us, and we went right in to talk to my uncle about it. It felt like he was placing a spotlight on our romance. My uncle wouldn't even listen to our complaints as he showed us pictures of the company house that came with my new job. He told us to go get married, enjoy our honeymoon, then get ready to come back and work our asses off. We drove right out to the house, which was maintained by a small staff of servants and a gardener. When we arrived, the gardener was raking leaves on the lawn and came out to greet us. Diana and I were somewhat ecstatic and decided that for our honeymoon, all we really wanted to do was have the house for ourselves for a couple of weeks. We gave the staff a paid leave and started moving in piecemeal style. It really was one of the best times of our lives, getting to just be alone with each other finally. I'd have to put it right up there with the birth of our 2 kids later on. I remember the first time I saw Diana in jeans. We were out raking the leaves, then diving in them like children. We ended up liking the casual and genuine sides of each other even more than the formal and public sides. I remember we cooked burgers that night on an old grill that had seen better days, but worked well enough to get the job done. After dinner, we got a little tipsy and started chasing each other around the lawn. It was really too dark out for us to be doing that, but we were young and we were in love. At one point, Diana tripped and fell face first into a big pile of leaves, causing both of us to laugh hysterically. I knew she wasn't hurt by her convulsive laughter. We were having the most fun 2 people could have. And then, behind my wife, the leaf pile itself seemed to rise up into the sky. It was really like seeing a new volcano form or something, as the dark silhouette was just so massively huge and kept getting larger. It seemed to keep rising higher and higher, dwarfing my still laughing wife, who was down on her knees, unaware of the activity behind her. I, myself, was stunned and confused by what I was seeing. I think I just stared uncomprehendingly, wondering what that was, as the leaves began to fall off of it onto my wife. That was when she noticed something was going on between the expression on my face and the leaves falling on hers. She ran toward me before looking behind, so she was in my arms and still didn't actually know what was going on, as though to help us get a clue about what was happening. The immense, dark silhouette began to howl. I still could not see its form clearly, but it looked like the Hulk from the Avengers movies as it stood there in the darkness, backlit by the moon and some lights from a neighbor's property in the distance. I pulled my girlfriend and myself backward, slowly and incrementally, toward the house. I didn't want to make any sudden moves that might upset our very large and angry trespasser. I still, at that point, thought it might be a human. I thought he was an oversized human of extremely limited intelligence who had been living homeless in the nearby woods. I assumed he had been sleeping in that leaf pile, and we had accidentally disturbed him. I wanted to get the two of us inside to safety, but as we backed away, it slowly advanced, keeping an equal distance between us. It was shades of brown and gray, and it was impossible to see where the autumn leaves left off and the person or creature itself began. This was someone or something colored exactly so that autumn leaves would easily disguise it, especially at night. Eventually, enough of the leaves had dropped off, and it had moved forward enough to begin to be lit by our house lights. I think Diana and I both saw it clearly for the first time together. This was a ferocious-looking dog-headed monster thing. It was not a man. It was probably too large to be a man, to be honest. It had ears on top of its head, so this was not a human, it was an animal of some sort. When it was near the house like that, its eyes reflected back the light 10 times over. They were almost blinding. They looked self-illuminated like little flashlights in his skull. But I know it was a reflection because the effect didn't happen until we were close enough to the house. Whatever it was, it seemed confused and agitated. There are some animals you meet that seem savage, others that seem like they just want to mind their own business, and others who are downright friendly. This one was confused by our presence, as though he or it had never seen anything like us before. I can only imagine we were giving similar expressions back to it. We were all very surprised by the presence of each other. I had said it was like a dog-headed man, but those are just words to try to begin to describe it. It had a chest like a man, but it was furry like a dog. It stood like a bear, but the body shape was nothing like a bear, and the legs bent backwards like the devil's legs. They might have even had cloven hooves for all I know. I don't remember caring about the feet at the time. It had a mouth with teeth that seemed like a dog or a cat's teeth, some kind of meat eater. The ears were pointed and twitchy, not rounded like a bear's ears, while the eyes, as I said, looked surprised. They also looked outraged and unhappy at the same time. Without any warning whatsoever, the creature's temper elevated straight up to furious, and with an enraged expression on its massive face, it bent down and screamed right at us. I could feel and smell its hot, nasty breath as though the thing were inches from us, but it was actually probably a good 15 or 20 feet away. Instinct took over and we ran. I never ran so hard, and my back tickled as I expected the beast to catch up to me any second. I knew if it did, it could take me down easily. I got the door open and Diana ran past me, screaming. Glancing back, I saw the Dogman retreating quickly into the woods. The shouting must have been a bluff to give it a chance to escape the confrontation. It must have been almost as scared of us as we were of it. A whole lot of different things about this sighting make absolutely no sense to me at all. The way that Dogman was looking at us, it was clear it had never seen a human before. What could possibly exist in Michigan that wouldn't have seen a human before it reached adulthood? There are just so many of us people here. And we don't just stay in the towns and cities, we go camping, we go hunting, we go hiking. The chances of something that actually lives in the area not knowing what a human was before it reached the size of the Incredible Hulk, that just seems almost impossible to me. So, if that Dogman wasn't a natural predator from the area around where we lived, then where exactly did it come from? Nobody in my family or on our staff has reported another sighting of the creature or anything resembling it in the decades since this event. That lends strength to my theory that the creature really was out of place and must have come from somewhere else. Where else? I just can't even guess. However, we do live in Michigan, which is famous for Dogman sightings. Just because we never saw the thing again doesn't mean it hasn't been here. To Diana and myself, the Dogman is a kind of a symbol of the ultimate mystery. We've told our kids that they might still be living in the area and that they better watch out for them. I have no idea if they've taken our advice to heart or if they just think their parents are crazy, but we've done our due diligence and warned them. To this day, we both remain completely confused about what exactly happened the night that we met the camouflaged Dogman. I saw Dogman with two melanistic cats. Dear Scary Stories NYC. I live in Pennsylvania in a rural area called Smock that is not very far from the Chestnut Ridge. I was out hunting with my best friend Carl, and we both saw the same thing which I am about to describe to you. We both saw what absolutely had to be a Dogman, and we saw that it was hunting with two big cats that are also not supposed to exist. We saw a whole lot of impossible that day, so let me try to explain. Carl and I had two hunting stands that we would use in this place that we hunted in those years. It was owned by a friend of ours who stopped being our friend after the election in 2016. But this was probably back around 2013 when this happened, and he was still a nice person back then. So we were walking toward our hunting blinds, which were up in trees that we had rigged to be more comfortable to sit in for hours while waiting for prey to happen by. We weren't even about halfway to the fork in the path when we would split off from each other, when we heard something big coming through the woods from directly in front of us. To be clear, we were on a narrow dirt path, but whatever was approaching was coming directly through the trees and underbrush. That meant it almost couldn't be human, and it almost had to be very large. Carl and I ducked down behind a boulder and hoped that we weren't about to get trampled by a herd of deer or something, We hugged the underside of that rock like we were snails or slugs. I really wanted to live to tell this story, but I had this big sense of fear that the story might not have a happy ending. I can't stand getting that feeling when I'm in the woods. My daddy used to tell me that if you feel like you're in trouble, then you are. But his solution wasn't to run away from the trouble. No, Daddy's advice was to stop thinking of yourself as being in trouble. He taught me about self-fulfilling prophecies. If you think you're about to get stomped on, then you're helping to bring that reality into existence. Always think you're going to get out of this situation and have an excellent campfire story to tell. That was my daddy's advice, not just to me, but to anyone who wanted to even be a part-time outdoorsman. I tried very hard to think that way, but while hugging the underside of that boulder with Carl's head near my crotch, I wasn't feeling like much of a winner. The moments when whatever that was approached us and we realized we might be about to get a clear glimpse of what it was as it walked by were the most frightening of my life. I felt like I was in a horror movie, and even as we actually began to smell the body odor of something coming very close, neither of us had yet guessed what that was. Absolutely no matter what we saw in the next few seconds, it wasn't gonna surprise us. Or at least that's what we thought. But then, a big old mountain lion, and I mean big, like some kind of panther or something, walked by, completely black from its head to its tail. It walked in a relaxed pose and somehow didn't sense our presence. I would have thought we'd be emanating enough fear scent to attract predators from 3 miles around, but maybe this cat had just eaten or something because it just seemed to be chilling and strolling. Like I said though, it was jet black, and there is not supposed to be any cat that large and that color in the United States. While we were still amazed by that, we were doubly stunned when a female cat, looking like the same exact breed of darkly colored mountain lion, trotted up from behind, and the two began nuzzling each other. So that's why he was relaxed. He had his mate with him. As beautiful and rare a scene as we were witnessing, I was holding my breath and praying that Carl and I could remain completely immobile until those two man-eating panther-type creatures were very far away. They say things happen in threes, but even the person who coined that term would have been stunned by what we saw next. In fact, I don't even know how to describe the next animal. There was another creature with the cats that seemed to be their leader. It stood on its hind legs like a man, and I got the vibe of Tarzan leading his two panthers through the jungle. Now, I don't know if Tarzan had panther friends, to be honest, but if he did, it would look like this scene. The thing is, that third creature wasn't Tarzan. It wasn't even a human, although it walked on its hind legs like one. This was a hairy man that stood upright, not slouched as a gorilla or chimp might. I don't think it was actually a primate, though, because the head was long and shaped more like a carnivorous deer or a pointed-eared dark gray bear. We saw the three creatures rubbing up against each other, and they seemed like a family unit or a hunting team. We stuck to that rock till long after we couldn't hear those things anymore. Even when we came out of hiding, we kept whispering to each other and looking around, completely paranoid that those things were gonna come back. Carl said that was the Dogman, and maybe he was right. I know that since he said that to me, I can kind of see it like an upright walking canine, but Since I saw its midsection first, which was very humanoid, and tried to interpret its head secondarily, I really did not instantly see it as a dog. I was looking up at it from a weird angle under a rock, and I'd never looked 6 or 7 feet up into the air to see the underside of a dog head before. So, I guess that might be why I guessed differently about its identity. Also, in my defense, it did not have its tongue hanging out like a dog. It did not behave like a canine. It seemed more intelligent than any dog I'd ever met. Neither Carl nor I have ever seen anything like any of those 3 animals ever again. If you ask the scientists and the experts, none of these could possibly even exist. Yet, we saw them, and we were terrified of them. Any one of those 3 could have taken us both out. The idea of them hunting together? Well, maybe there's a reason you never hear about these creatures. Maybe the other witnesses didn't live to tell the tale. It's a sobering thought to think about. I suppose the thing that I really learned that day is that you should never assume that just because you're a human, and just because you go out well-armed and prepared into the woods, that you're the top of the food chain. If you get too smug and too self-assured when you're out in nature, then you might just find yourself getting a bit of a re-education from Dogman and the 2 melanistic big cats. Hey, it's me, Henry Lee Dogman, here to thank those of you who support all of us here at Scary Stories NYC. It really helps us if you click like, and if you forward our videos or leave cool comments. If you can, it helps us even more when you let us share our 25-episode and growing collection of uncensored, scary Dogman stories with you by becoming a paid subscriber at peterbernard.com. That's right, join our monthly club and get 25 stories right off the bat, each of them wilder than what we're allowed to tell you on this channel. Then, each Sunday, get another new scary story, usually a Dogman story, but always uncensored and secret, available nowhere else on the planet. Please consider joining us today at peterbernard.com and keep the scary stories coming. Thanks, everyone. Well, since I saw you last, my computer keyboard broke, then I got sick, and I have a fever, and then my backup keyboard broke, then the keyboard on my second computer broke. I ordered a new quiet backlit keyboard so I could write stories into the night without waking anyone up, but it's not set to arrive till Tuesday or Wednesday. What happened to Amazon sending drones out to deliver us stuff on the same day? Why is it taking so long to get the new keyboard to me? So, I tried downloading one of those speech-to-text things, and it worked pretty well on my phone, but I can't write that way. It's like when people pressure me to learn improv or write in a group with other people, I avoid them afterward. I can't write by talking, I write by writing. So, I got out my 99-cent paper notebook and a pen, and I hand-wrote this story for you today, based on an email I received from one of you who chooses to remain anonymous. Get comfortable, sit back, and get ready for a really cool, scary story. Please excuse me if I sound a bit under the weather. I think YouTube scrubs all the germs out of our videos before letting you watch them, so I don't think you can catch anything from me. This one is pretty good, I think, and it was sent in by a married couple who claims they saw 2 different kinds of Dogman at the same time. And that story is called The Duay-o and the Snarly Yow. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I have a Dogman story that goes way back to before my wife and I were married, when we were first dating each other. We were both around 20 years old at the time, and her family had just begun to get to know me. I wasn't sure about how they saw me or felt about me, so one week when they invited me to meet them at their church that Sunday, I took it as a sign that they were beginning to see me as a good choice for their daughter. I tried to act as normal as possible, like someone I had seen on TV. Nobody in my family was normal, we were all weirdos, so I took my cues from television and tried to behave in a way I hoped they would see as civilized. My girlfriend Bonnie, not her real name, looked really awesome that day, but I forced myself not to stare at her or say anything ungentlemanly. If you've ever been a 20-year-old guy, then you know how hard that must have been for me to pull off. I must have done an okay job of faking the civilized bit, because after the service, instead of walking Bonnie and her family home, her parents suggested that she and I walk off alone for a while and enjoy the lovely day. In fact, they suggested we go walk along the dry run. It was a real show of trust from her parents that they were encouraging us to be alone. Being young, we aimed to abuse that trust as quickly as possible. The dry run I'm talking about is the one in Wolfsville, Maryland. That's where this story took place. It's an old riverbed that's dry much of the year. We knew that if we went into those woods then took a left at the dry run, it would eventually lead us back to Bonnie's parents' house. That's why, when she and I found it, we took a right turn instead. I'd like to take a sidetrack of my own right now and loop back to the name of this town. Yes, it's Wolfsville, and I'm about to tell you about us sighting not one but two different kinds of strange wolf-like entities. Officially, though, the town was not named for being the land of werewolves or anything like that. There actually used to be a family named Wolf that lived there in the 1800s, and that's where the name comes from. But it seems a bit ironic to me that this is also the general area in which multiple kinds of what we call Dogman have been being reported for years. Stay tuned, I'll get back to that. So anyway, this was one of those days in your life that you live for, that you yearn for. We were both so happy. It didn't matter that we weren't doing anything at all. We walked hand in hand. We appreciated each other. We enjoyed being alive. Time seemed to stand still and become eternity all at once. And then I remember opening my eyes after an extremely romantic kiss and noticing that time, in fact, had not slowed down in the slightest. Back in consensus reality, it had actually been passing more rapidly than either of us could have realized. In fact, it was already starting to get dark out. I bolted up and looked around. Was it going to rain? Or was it really getting as late as I thought it was? From behind me, Bonnie gasped. She had just checked the time. Those were not storm clouds overhead. That was nighttime encroaching. Bonnie was concerned that we would get back to her family's place late for dinner and squander the good faith we had just won. I was starting to be concerned that we might be lost. I looked around and realized I was already uncertain where exactly we were since we had wandered away from the dry run. If we could find our way back to that, we'd have a 50-50 chance of going in the right direction afterward. Bonnie seemed to know where to go, and so I followed after her. She cut through some trees, and it was already very dark under that tree canopy. My heart quickened a bit, and I started to get a little more nervous, but I tried not to let her see. After some period of time running after her, she suddenly turned and asked me if she had just made the right turn or not. I realized she didn't know any better than I did where we were going. I decided we should take a deep breath and get our bearings, look around, and then make a conscious, mutual decision where to go next. She was nervous and antsy and didn't want to stop for anything. She wanted to keep going while discussing it. I put it out that if we kept going, we might be going in a very wrong direction. That caused her to stop, and we both began taking note of our surroundings. Standing there and looking around, neither of us noticed any landmarks or anything that seemed at all familiar to us. I looked up at the sky and I saw the moon. That meant nothing to either one of us, though. In spite of the fact that she and I had both grown up out in the country, neither of us had ever learned the stars or constellations, so neither of us could ascertain anything from looking up at the sky. We couldn't tell which way was north, east, south, or west. Something happened just then that helped us make the decision on which direction to run in. We heard the sound of branches cracking and someone, or something, very large, approaching from that one particular direction. That narrowed our choices down, and our decision was to run in the opposite direction of that sound crashing through the woods. We soon were making so much noise ourselves, running frantically as fast as we could, that it was impossible to tell if anything was following us. Our screaming and running was louder than all the other sounds in the forest combined. At least to us. Bonnie was whimpering, and I was huffing and puffing. We both were slipping and sliding and going in all directions, besides the one we wanted to head in. We couldn't really see where we were going in the dark, and it was damp and slippery in there. After what seemed like a really long time, we came upon a clearing, and, peering out into it from behind the cover of a large bush, we could see the dry run out there. I would have felt a sense of relief, except that wasn't the only thing I saw. I also saw a truly large dog, entirely black, and with coal red eyes. My first thought was Black Shuck, who is a legend from England. Black Shuck was alleged to have been an immense black dog that attacked churchgoers hundreds of years ago during a thunderstorm. What was he doing back here in Maryland? Bonnie and I hesitated to leave our hiding spot. We felt safe there. The dog didn't seem to have spied us yet, and I think we both would have preferred to wait for the creature to leave before entering out into the dry run to find the rest of our way back to Bonnie's home. It stood there as we first spotted it, then took a sitting position and stared, tongue hanging out and panting, into the woods behind us and to our right. It seemed to be expecting something. If it was expecting us, we aimed to disappoint him. Although it was dark, and the creature was darker, we could make out some features. It appeared to be very shaggy, and it appeared to have pointed ears up on top of its head. It sometimes raised them in the air when listening to sounds that it was hearing deep in the forest beyond us. As for its eyes, all I could make out was that glowing red. I never saw pupils, and I couldn't be 100% sure of what direction it was looking in, since all I saw was that glowing red color. I did not at the time think it was actually Black Shuck from ancient England, but I didn't think we were imagining it either. I felt as though if we could figure out what made that dog's eyes seem to glow, we would have the solution to the legend of Black Shuck. Rather than feeling that I was having a supernatural experience, I felt I was witnessing scientific proof that Black Shuck could really be based on a true story. I guess my assumption was that if I saw something in the present with my own two eyes, then that made it scientifically true. I did not believe in the paranormal or the supernatural, and I felt that all such explanations or worldviews belonged deep in humanity's past, back in the time of myth and legend. We live in the age of science and reason. That's how I felt. Then, that big black dog became stiff and at full attention, noticing something we couldn't see or hear. It began to howl so loudly it was like being hit by a wave of something invisible but hard. We both covered our ears, but it still hurt anyway. In those moments, while the great beast howled, I felt as though we had regressed back into caveman times, and all of our primal fears and superstitions had returned full force. Gone was logic. Gone was reason. Back in their comfortable old places were fear, cowardice, and primitive fight or flight instincts. I wanted to run away from there screaming, and it took all of my remaining self-control to prevent me from doing so. As it was, my cheeks were wet with my own tears. Bonnie, for her part, seemed to be holding together better than I was. I assumed that was in part due to her trust in me being strong through this. So I wiped my face clean and quieted my internal horror down. We would get through this. All we had to do was wait for the impossibly large dog to go away. It was at that moment that my sense of hope and internal faith rose just a bit. I would be brave because I had to be for Bonnie's sake. It was as simple as that. When life seems simple, it feels possible to succeed. It's only when we let life get complicated that we begin to feel like giving up. Confident that I had the entire world figured out, I relaxed and watched the giant black red-eyed canine, patiently waiting for it to finish its business there and allow us to resume our journey homeward. All of that renewed confidence and hope came crashing down as, to our right and not very far away, we heard that dog's howl returned. The sound of the second howling caused us to once again cover our ears due to its painful volume. The black dog out in the clearing, however, obviously recognized the sound of that howl as it stood up again on all fours and began wagging its tail furiously and happily. It was like a pet dog, excited to see his master return home from work. Whatever had made that howl must have also been the thing we heard in the woods that we had run away from. Was that thing chasing us? Or was it just coming here to meet up with this other dog? Had it heard us or smelled us? Were we still safe in our hiding spot? Or was the second, still unseen creature going to out us to the other one? Should we be running? Or should we make ourselves as small and silent as we could? We chose the second option. Out of the woods, behind us and to our right, walked a dark silhouette twice as tall as that dog across the way. I'm talking a good 7 or 8 feet tall. At least that was the impression this thing gave. It was clearly, even in the darkness, an animal, and yet it came out of that forest on its hind legs. Bonnie whispered, "Bigfoot," into my ears. So I looked, and that was exactly what my mind's eye saw. It was a very tall Bigfoot, coming home from work and being greeted by his loving dog. Then, that supposed Bigfoot walked out from the tree cover and into the moonlight. If this was a Sasquatch, it was one with a dog-like head. The first second I saw that monster is frozen in my mind forever. I could see almost all of it in one sight, and it was unlike anything I had ever seen before or have ever seen since. It appeared to be ferocious and a carnivore, and yet it was walking fully upright, like some sort of British lord or gentleman. It was not hunched over like an ape. It did not look like a primate in any way. It seemed like an elegant, dignified, savage, man-eating predator. It looked like it could eat a family of 5, then go have tea time. I thought in my brain that it was a werewolf, but I didn't think it would ever change back into human form. I didn't think it was actually a British lord. This thing wasn't human at all. It was something other. And once again, my younger self marveled at the, quote, scientific proof of what must have inspired werewolf legends, unquote, walking in front of me. The two immense hairy beasts greeted each other warmly. The quadruped jumped up on the bipedal one, and at first they really did resemble a human greeting his pet dog. Soon enough, though, the interaction began to include them both sniffing each other's butts, and you knew that neither of those entities out there were human in any way. For one thing, the upright one's eyes glowed just as brightly as the red-eyed shock one. The thing is, his eyes glowed a kind of amber yellow, not red. So they had to be different species from each other, I would think. The two of them walked off with each other into the forest, and I could see from behind that the upright Dogman had a very long, very furry tail and legs, which reminded me of the back legs of a goat. It sent a chill through me as the backward bent legs gave the creature a kind of a devilish look. The two of them were out of our view in the woods very quickly. It was remarkable to me how fast the entire ordeal ended when it had seemed that it never might, only a few seconds earlier. Bonnie and I, holding hands, tentatively came out from behind the bush and ran toward the dry run. We both knew our way home from there, and we made it to her house just as her father was preparing to go out looking for us. When the man saw his daughter's nice dress covered in mud, he became furious and asked Bonnie what I had done to her. She told him it wasn't me. It was a giant dog and his werewolf master that we were avoiding. That's what caused her Sunday clothing to become a mess. Now, I did not expect her father to believe her when she said that. However, the anger immediately drained from his face, along with any color whatsoever. He put his arms around both of us and led us inside, where we were fussed over. After we retold our experience to the family, the parents kept shooting each other knowing glances. I didn't know what any of that meant at the time. After we had finished our narratives, Bonnie's father told us he knew what we had seen, because 20 years earlier, not far from that spot, he had himself seen one of those two creatures, the upright one. In fact, he told us it had a name locally, the Duay-o, or Duay-o. Bonnie gasped at the name, recognizing it, but somehow this myth or legend had evaded my upbringing. Bonnie said the Duay-o is the local werewolf around there. It had been a big deal in Wolfsville back in the mid-1960s before we were born. The press reported that a man had to struggle with the creature who fought on his hind legs like a human. Eventually, the man was able to drive the Dogman off and protect his wife and young child. Bonnie's dad said the time he saw the monster, it ran bipedally across the Dwight D. Eisenhower Highway in the direction of Greenbrier State Park. The entire sighting took up maybe 5 or 6 seconds total, and then the thing was gone. It had been running, he reminded us, on its hind legs, same as the thing we saw. So what was the other creature we saw? I asked, referring to the quadrupedal red-eyed dog. That, Bonnie's dad told us, was the Snarly Yow. I smiled and almost laughed, telling him, okay, now you're making stuff up. The Snarly Yow? He was for real, though. The Snarly Yow is a cryptid described exactly like what we saw, down to the red, glowing eyes. It's mainly known to appear in the South Mountain area, according to the internet. And guess what? South Mountain State Park is literally an 8-minute drive from Wolfsville. So I have to say, Wolfsville, for a place not named after the Dogman, sure has a lot of different kinds of Dogman sightings happening all around it. Those of you who know the area but not these legends might laugh at the idea of such a nice suburban community being haunted by mythical beasts from the deepest forests. However, if you pull back a bit on a satellite map, you'll notice that Wolfsville is in this civilized area situated between two very large swaths of entirely undeveloped natural area. There's state park after campground after natural area after wildlife preserve over there, and enough game for any land predator to survive quite comfortably. Even if I hadn't seen the two dog monsters myself, I would think they probably could really exist there. But I did see those monsters, and so did my wife. It's not a matter of belief for us. It's a matter of knowledge. We know for a fact that such things do indeed exist. When we eventually had our own children, we raised them to respect the woods as a dangerous place. Yes, it's beautiful and bountiful, but it's not a safe place for humans, especially not after dark. And that's because around Wolfsville, stories of werewolves are not just cautionary tales for kids. That's because Wolfsville is the home of the Duay-o and the Snarly Yow. Welcome to Scary Stories. I'm not your old pal Bigfoot. My stories are not for young ones. So if there are any of those kinds of you out there, get up and get out now. What about you? I see you over there. You look a mite too young to be listening to such scary stories. Show me your ID. That's what I thought. Get out. Alright. As long as it's only us old people left, I'll tell you this scary new Dogman encounter we got sent. Warning. This story features recreations of the Screaming Dogman, referenced in the title. Some of the screams are loud and happen at unexpected points in the narrative. If you have a weak heart or react poorly to sudden noises, you may want to watch something less scary. And now, dim the lights and get your popcorn ready. If you're driving or operating heavy machinery, you might want to pull off the road and shut things down right now. Choose a dark and spooky spot to park and lock all your doors, because we're about to tell you the allegedly true tale of the Screaming Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I was a guy who grew up in Pennsylvania believing everything I was told and living a life of utmost normality. I had a chance to move up in the world, but when I discovered the habits of the social class above me, I recoiled in horror. They didn't like that reaction, and I very quickly found myself unemployed and unemployable. I became homeless faster than I would have thought possible, and I hit the road with nothing in my pocket and nothing to my name. But don't worry. This story isn't just about me whining about how badly the world treated me. It's also a story about how I got scared out of my mind by The Screaming Dogman. I found myself wandering into Scranton, Pennsylvania one day on foot, looking for work and a room to sleep in. I didn't know anybody there, so I hoped I could find some low-paying manual labor and begin a new life in Scranton on the down low. As I was wandering around, my stomach growling, I caught the sight of my reflection in a store window. I looked a mess, and nobody was going to hire me in that state. I wished I had a place to sleep and take a shower, and then it popped into my mind. There was a guy named Gerald that I used to be friends with at work. He had a cabin south of Scranton, and he had let me stay there once. He had made me a key. Did I still have it? I reached into my pocket and pulled out my key ring. Each one of them used to allow me entrance into places in my life, which were now all lost and barred for me from ever re-entering, except possibly one, the key to Gerald's cabin, located a 20-minute drive south of Scranton, deep in the woods, just south of the Green Run. I visualized it in my mind. I had no car, so I would have to try to walk there. It was December and it had been snowing, so that meant I'd have to walk through snow in the woods. The path to drive there took me well out of my way, so I decided to risk walking there directly through the trees. I didn't even know if that would be possible, but I didn't see as how I had much of a choice about it. I stole a candy bar from a newsstand and made my way into the woods, hoping I would find shelter before I died of exposure. According to my watch, which was no longer keeping perfect time, I arrived at the cabin nearly 4 hours later, wet and cold from head to foot. The problem was, the lights in the cabin appeared to be on. Gerald was still there. Usually he was gone from the cabin by Thanksgiving at the latest. The place was so remote that you could get snowed in and trapped if you stayed there in the winter. I cursed Gerald under my breath. He had 3 homes. Why did he have to be at the most inconvenient one, especially on a night when I was literally going to freeze to death? I just wanted to cry, but I didn't have the energy. I walked over to Gerald's supply shack to see if that was locked and if I could maybe try to stay in there for the night, when I heard the sound of a car ignition start. It was Gerald. He was leaving. As sad as I had been a minute earlier, that's how happy I was to see his fancy car drive away. I used to own the same car, but the model from the year prior to his. Already that was gone from my personality. Already I resented his privilege, even though I had once taken the same lifestyle for granted. It's amazing how much what you are allowed in life determines your behavior and personality. Waiting for the car to leave, I entered the house and made a beeline for the bedroom to see if Gerald had left any of his winter wardrobe there. It turns out he had, and he was only a bit larger than I was. I changed into dry clothing, then raided his pantry and passed out in a warm bed for the first time in weeks. The first night was quiet and peaceful for me, although I was too tired to wake up even if an atom bomb had gone off outside. I slept 10 or 11 straight hours before I woke up. This was the late 1990s, and for that time, the cabin was decked out with luxuries. He had a phone line, and he had a PC computer with a 56K modem attached. Maybe it was 128K by then, I don't remember, but it was the old, loud, squeaky kind of internet connection. I resolved to look for a job in Scranton, or at other local places such as a resort in those woods that was actually closer than Scranton. Once I managed to get paying work, I would be able to save up and get my own room in town, and it would have to be before spring, because that's when Gerald will likely be coming out to stay at the cabin again. I would need to start earning cash much sooner, as there was only a week or two of food left in the place as it was. So I had my work cut out for me and I had a tight deadline. Via the internet, I saw there was an open house for manual labor jobs at an agency in town that afternoon. I showered and shaved and changed into Gerald's nicest available clothes and snow boots and set off for Scranton through the woods and the snow. When I finally arrived at the interview, I felt like I was going to pass out. It had started to snow as I arrived, though, so everyone after me came in covered in snow just like me, and it made me look less horrible and out of place. Basically, everyone looked like they had walked through the forest in the snow, so I was able to relax. I got the job, which started the next day, and I left the place elated. As I trudged home through the woods, it grew darker and colder, and a feeling of hopelessness began to take over. So what, I had a job. It wouldn't pay for 2 weeks. I couldn't work for 9 hours, then walk 10 hours each day. It would only leave 5 hours for everything else, including sleep. It was too much. I had to find another solution. As I trudged through the snow, my deep sadness sunk down into my exhaustion, and somehow I was filled with a sense of hope that felt like it was lighting me up inside. Someone inside me was telling me that each day we would find another solution to each problem. The game wasn't about winning. The game was about not giving up. Someone or something, somehow, gave me the energy to make it back to the cabin, and I ate, then fell asleep in a deep feeling of gratitude. Someone screaming woke me up in the middle of the night. I was completely disoriented and didn't know where it was coming from. Was it Gerald? Had he come home and seen me in his cabin? I didn't see anyone else in the room. Getting up and inspecting the rest of the one-floor cabin, I found nobody else there. I started to wonder if I had dreamed the sound of the screaming, and I went back to bed, but I couldn't sleep. It must be my nerves, I thought. Overexertion, lack of sleep, too much worry. These things can all take a toll on you, I reminded myself. Soon, I was feeling much more relaxed, and I began to drift back to... Okay, I didn't dream that. It came from the other room. Racing out there, I saw it. In the window. It was outside the cabin, looking right at me, with wild, insane-looking eyes. And it was screaming. It wasn't Gerald. It wasn't even a man. It was some kind of werewolf thing. The ugliest creature I'd ever seen was standing there, straggly, black and gray hair shooting out in all directions, drooling on itself, fangs displayed ominously. It banged against the side of the house with what sounded like fists, giving the impression of a crazed mental patient wanting to be let out. Only this fellow seemed to be wanting to be let in. It pushed its face grotesquely against the glass and distorted itself horribly. I found myself crying. I just wanted this monster to leave me alone. Its mucus and saliva were all over the glass, and I felt nauseous just having to see it. I began openly weeping. My nervous system had gone on overload. I was no longer able to cope with any of this. I went to bed and curled up in a fetal position as the Dogman kept screaming outside. I pulled the covers up over my head the way a child would do. As insane as that dog-headed hairy abomination outside was acting, that's only half as insane as I felt. When I saw the sun coming up, I knew I was already late. Basically, I was screwed. I got dressed and ran out, in my mind trying to calculate how to cut time off the trip. I had found Gerald's compass the night before, and I resolved to use it to travel more as the crow flies and get there on time for work. I actually got in 2 minutes late and got a reprimand, but it was the best reprimand I can ever remember. I had succeeded in getting to Scranton in just under 3 hours. It was a huge boost to my confidence, and I went through the day feeling that no matter how tired I was, I could accomplish miracles and do anything that the world demanded of me. My new boss seemed to notice this attitude, and he was very encouraging toward me. Things seemed to have finally taken a turn for the better in my life, and I felt better than I had in quite some time. Then, work ended, and I had to face that long walk home through the woods. When the sky was already getting darker, it was at that moment that I remembered something that I had been completely forgetting all day long. I hadn't been thinking at all about that screaming Dogman. 1 hour into my walk home, the woods were already very dark. I was not making time the way I had in the morning. Every little sound was making me jump. Was that the screaming Dogman there? Would he get me before I made it back to the cabin? I prayed to make it back and lock the doors before the thing noticed me alone and unprotected, walking through the woods. Walking through its woods. I felt the coldest shiver, and I realized I was losing body heat with all this negative self-talk. I was panicking and getting nervous, and then I tripped over my own feet and landed face first in a pile of snow. Now the inside of my jacket had ice in it, and I was really creating a bad situation for myself. I needed to calm down. I needed to focus, and I needed to get inside. The idea of being inside that warm, dry cabin with the Dogman screaming at me outside actually seemed comforting to me at that moment. The night before, it had seemed like the ultimate horror, but if I could have been inside and warm with the Dogman outside, to me, at that moment, that would have been the ultimate luxury. Everything is relative. By the time I reached the green run and I knew I was almost there, I was dizzy and feverish. I felt like I was burning up both physically and mentally. I was also blushing in this weird way. I was ashamed that I was so scared, and I felt like when that Dogman caught me out in the woods alone, he was going to punish me worse than any parent had ever punished any misbehaving child. I think it was the sense of utter powerlessness in the face of that monster that made me feel so deeply ashamed. I was powerless when my former friends banded together to lie about me and ruin me, and now I was powerless against this monster. I remembered my parents raising me to believe that the world was just and fair, but the world is neither. It's not even fair to the ones born with silver spoons in their mouths. Life is just random, and if you don't stay a step ahead, you get stepped on and left behind. My dreams of success and marriage, a family, they were all so far in my past I couldn't even see them in the rearview mirror. My only goal anymore, for the rest of my life, would be to survive to the next day, and to keep my head low in order not to lose even the right to keep trying to survive. When your enemies are big, your options are small. I began to feel sick. Something smelled awful. Was that my own body odor? It was there, behind me. It was much larger in person with no glass between us. It had hands at the end of long, muscular, yet lanky, human-like, hairy arms. The hands were much bigger than human hands. He could probably hold a basketball like it was a baseball. Of course, he'd be at risk of puncturing the b-ball with his long-curved, sharp-looking claws, which were at the end of each long finger. This couldn't have just been an animal. This was something else. and I'm not sure what. Either it really was from outer space, or another dimension, or another world underground, or something ridiculous like that. I never believed in anything like that, and maybe the fact that I'm entertaining the ideas now only proves that poverty has actually driven me completely loco. But this man-like hairy monster with a dog head, but opposable thumbs, is not likely to ever get caught by the mountain monsters, guys. I just don't think it's real in the same sense that a bear is. That doesn't mean I don't think it can eat humans for dinner if it chooses to, and that doesn't mean I didn't recognize that I was in great physical danger. It just means that I figured, after the thing had ended me, he might just go poof, back to his reality or my imagination or wherever he sprang from. Does that make sense? No, of course it doesn't. Nothing about the Dogman monster really makes sense. To me, at that moment, the Dogman was fear itself, and it was frantically screaming at me. All emotion drained out as I saw each thing I had ever done replayed in front of my eyes. I felt regret each time I had done something hurtful. I felt longing each time I had lost someone or something. I felt shame, as it all seemed so short and filled with missed opportunities and failure. I knew it was probably pointless, but I was going to make an all-out effort to get around that monster and get back into that cabin. I couldn't remember if I had bothered to lock the front door when I had left that morning. The plan formed in my head probably wouldn't work if I had to open the door with the key. Nonetheless, I took the key out, armed my hand with it in case it would be needed, then I started running directly toward the Dogman. Shocked, it screamed. This time, I screamed back. And I kept running, staring right into its very surprised-looking eyes. When I reached the corner of the house, I faked left, then turned right, running from one corner of the back of the house to the further one. I would then make a left, then another left when I reached the front of the house. I would need to get there before the Dogman, and no human can outrun a thing like that. I needed the creature to be chasing me behind me for it to go as planned. If it figured out what I was thinking and doubled back to head me off the other way around the house, then I was toast. I had no backup plan. It was this or start improvising. As I turned the corner to my final approach before the front door, I looked left and saw nobody there. Relieved, I looked behind me and the beast was 2 steps behind and reaching out to try to grab me. I skidded around the front and threw myself with full force into the front door. It was unlocked, and the door and I both flew inside. I grabbed the doorknob to arrest my forward movement and pushed the door to a loud slam as I fell onto the floor. The Dogman was instantly at the front door, pushing on it and banging. I got out to lock the door as I saw the doorknob jiggling. I pushed the bolt in place, locking it, just as the monster managed to open the doorknob lock. I tried to close that lock, but the Dogman's grip was stronger than mine, and it wasn't going to be locked unless he let go. With the bolt in the door locked, the Dogman was going to need to break the main wooden part of the door itself to get in. I sat down on the floor, and I watched him try, and try, and try. Just to his left and right, there were windows he could have easily broken and entered through. The creature seemed unaware of them and kept throwing his full body into the thick wooden door until I finally heard it crack. Or, well, I heard something crack. I don't remember falling asleep, but I remember waking up and heading out for work. I had to find another place to sleep that night, but I wasn't worried about it. Somehow, surviving a night like that makes problems like finding a bedroom suddenly seem small and easy. I asked around at work if anyone had a bed they could rent me, that I could pay them for when our first paycheck came in. I got several offers and I never went back to that cabin. And you couldn't pay me to go back there. To me, the symbol of being rock bottom in life from now on will always be the screaming Dogman.
I'd like to take a moment to say that if you have a scary story you'd like to tell us here, you can write Peter at peterbernard.com, or you can call our new Scary Stories hotline number and leave it to us in the form of a voicemail message. It's easy to remember. 804-LESCARY. That's 804-LESCARY, or 804-537-2279.
And now, get ready for an all-new, completely uncensored, slightly bloody, and absolutely terrifying new Dogman story. Oh, wait. YouTube won't allow me to tell you stories like that on this channel. If you want to hear that, you're going to have to go to peterbernard.com and sign up for our paid subscribers club. You can choose any price you can afford for a 1-month subscription, and then every weekend we tell you a story YouTube would never allow us to tell you on this channel. See you this Sunday for an all-new, very scary, completely uncensored Dogman story.
If you enjoyed this, please click like or consider subscribing. Remember to click the bell icon or you won't get notifications. If you want to listen to Bigfoot's secret uncensored story each Sunday, just go to peterbernard.com and become a paid subscriber. See you tomorrow. Same dog time, same dog channel.
Come back for more scary stories.